Hi, I'm Certified Sommelier Beverly Crandon, and welcome to the Wine Down, where we talk about all things wine and make it extremely approachable. Today's Wine Down is a bit more of a serious topic. Today on the Wine Down, we're going to talk about climate change and what it means for the world map of wine. Wine has always been a conversation between climate, soil, skill, what the French call terroir. But today, that delicate balance is under extreme pressure. As global climates start to climb, we're seeing some of the most prestigious vineyards, wineries, pack up roots, so to say, and head further north, south, higher, looking for cooler climates, further inland in hills and valleys, into areas that were once deemed not suitable to make great wine. So on today's Wine Down, we're going to take a look at climate change and how that's redrawing the world global map of wine, right? And what that means for us tomorrow, what that means for how we taste, how we grow, and just what we can expect in the glass moving forward. It's going to change quite a bit. The average global temperature has risen about 1 degree Celsius since the year 1900. And that is enough to affect microclimates and also to affect economies that are dependent on weather. And if you take a look at that in the trickle-down effect, that really is all of us. Now, in the world of wine, a half degree is monumental. Grapes grow in a very specific band of temperature and rainfall. So as that shifts, the vineyards also must follow. Real world examples, if you take a look at France's Champagne, summers there are getting hotter than ever before, which means that wineries and vineyard managers have to harvest a lot sooner. Some cases 20 days sooner than before. What that means is they've got to rethink their methods, both in the vineyard and also in the winery. That harvesting earlier also impacts the end result of the wine. So there's a lot to think about. So that's France's Champagne. And then on the other side, you've got South England, where you're seeing producers create some lovely sparkling wines that can rival some of the best name players out there, to the point where you're seeing people from France, producers from France, actually also go and invest in this area. They're recognizing the climate and how perfect it is for growing things like Chardonnay and making Blanc de Blancs, for example. While the temperature shift I just talked about may seem small on a scale, it is a monumental shift for wine. According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and studies from the University of Bordeaux, up to 50% of the world's current wine-growing regions could become less suitable for viticulture by the year 2050 if the warming trends continue. But this same warming trend that we're talking about has opened up some opportunities elsewhere. Areas that were once deemed way too cool in terms of temperature to grow grapes are now being considered the new frontier, and people are doing some investigations to see what they can do there, what's viable there. Places that were once deemed too marginal are now on the table. If I take a look at closer to home, where I am in Ontario, Niagara Peninsula, Prince Edward County, those areas are thriving as their growing season has been extended and the risk from frost is being limited. So we're seeing grapes like Cabernet Franc and Pinot Noir grow with more consistency than we've seen before. If I go across the Atlantic to my Scandinavian wine lovers over there, you're seeing places like Denmark explore Riesling, South Sweden explore Pinot Noir. These are things you would never have said 25, 30 years ago. But now we're seeing viable production come from these places. With that being said, those gains also come at a loss in some of our established wine regions. Italy's Tuscany, Spain's Rioja, California's Napa. These areas are suffering from drought, wildfires, and unpredictable growing seasons. You know, we did some research to see specifically in Tuscany what was being said over there. Marco Fizzioletti, director of Castello Quirk in Tuscany, himself said, "If climate change continues at this pace, we risk not just lower yields, but the loss of our wine's identity. We may still be able to make wine, but it will no longer be the wine that defines us." And this is major. All of those things that were just outlined by that wine executive in Tuscany has an effect on the consumer, has an effect on wine as we know it. Terroir has always been about permanence. That soil, microclimate, tradition, these things make up a wine's essence. But as vineyards start to migrate, terroir is no longer fixed. It's fluid. It's a variable, depending on where you're going. It's no longer the essence that we had known it to be about a wine for so long. Now we're hearing grape growers talk about something called adaptive terroir. That's where they're taking science, geography, and know-how and blending all those things together to come up with solutions amongst this change to still create and make viable wines. You're seeing some producers go higher up on slopes to plant their vines to get more cool air. You're seeing some go to resistant rootstock as climate change has affected even that. And then you're also seeing some going into solar-powered irrigation to try to preserve water because of droughts that you're getting with climate change. While all of these activities and innovations are great, I think it's important to note it's not innovation born just out of ambition. These are things that they had to do as a sense of urgency, as a sense of maintaining a business. As grapes move, flavor logically follows. I mean, we know that in warmer climates, you get wines that are bigger on the palate, more fruit forward, maybe elevated alcohol from the sugar levels in a grape because of ripeness. And we know in cooler climates, you get crispier, zippier, more high acid wines. And what we're seeing in those cool climates that were once deemed way too cold to make wine, but now are, because their growing seasons have been a little extended, now you're getting a great fruit makeup in those grapes that help to balance out that acidity in the wine. So what was once impossible is now possible. What does this all mean in practical examples? In British Columbia, a Merlot there today, it's probably going to taste more like Bordeaux did a century ago than Bordeaux does today itself. So that's one to chew on. So with these shifts that we're seeing in wine and climate and so forth, it's not just a topic that is baffling those who are in the business, but even the consumer, because you may be expecting one thing on the palate from this region you know you love historically, but then open up a bottle that you just purchased and now you're doing a bit of guesswork and wondering why it's slightly off from what you remember. If we look at Cornell University and their recent study from 2025, this study estimates that harvests are now happening 10 to 20 days earlier than just 30 years ago. This is a dramatic acceleration that affects sugar levels, alcohol content, even color in a wine. So there's a lot, as mentioned before, that now the consumer needs to take into consideration. What's positive to see that amongst this change in climate, not only are we seeing the producers themselves come up with innovative ways to still make wine that represents them as best they can, but we're also seeing associations, we're seeing countries, provinces, entire continents come up with programs and funding for research to help grape growers, to help the farmers, to ensure that we're still going to be able to maintain this economy around wine. In Ontario, you've got or Canada as a whole, you've got the climate smart management category under VQA. Here, they're talking about climate adaptive varieties. in how much so you're working with those, and also some sustainable behaviors in the vineyard and in the winery. Then if I go to California, Napa Green talks about climate smart wines as well. And here they're talking about adaptive varieties and also a bunch of sustainable activities. In Europe, there are several programs. Like one is called Life Adapted Viticulture. And again, that's looking at climate change and all the things that we can do to help the farmers, the grape growers, so they can adapt during these difficult or different times. Let's not forget the sustainable wines of, put your region or country in there, that exists in South America. You'll see that Chile, and there, if you read up on their program, you understand that's about water preservation. It's about just mindful practices, both for labor, for your people, and in the vineyard and the winery. So we're seeing a lot of work come down from not just the producers, but from government agencies as well. As consumers, we're not just spectators in this sport at all. I mean, we too have a role to play. Every bottle that we pick up in our wine store sends a signal back to the vineyard. So, I encourage you, the next time you're out buying wine, here are a couple of things to be mindful of. You want to look for bottles that have an indication of sustainable growing. Many producers now will label if they're organic, sustainable, biodynamic, climate smart, as we just talked about. Those things will be on the bottle. That's an indication of the winery doing all that they can to preserve the environment, to be mindful of climate change. And it usually also means it's an indicator of resilient farming. So it just tells you a little bit about the quality and what to expect, but these are responsible producers. I would also say the other thing to take into consideration, I mean, we all love to explore wines around the world, especially me. I am a massive fan of international wines, but I do support local when I can. And I encourage you to do the same thing, buying wines that are made closer to you. We know it's like less emissions, obviously. And you're also supporting that smaller farmer who has had to adapt during climate change to still try to produce wines for you, still try to produce grapes for winemakers, still try to make a living. So, I mean, those are a couple of things that you can consider during this time that we're going through, climate change, when buying some wine. We too can play a part. The story of wine has always been about evolution, right? From the earth, the grape, the glass. But now climate change is writing its newest chapter. On the topic of wine, what we now need to figure out is how we preserve its soul in this warming world. Thank you for joining me on today's Wine Down, where we talked about all things climate change. This is a serious topic, and you know what? I've got some comments, some thoughts. Are you seeing wines that you once used to get from one particular region or microclimate now changing somewhat? I'd love to get your thoughts. Are you exploring new territories that were once deemed unfit to grow grapes, and now people are making wonderful wines out of that? I'd love to get your thoughts there. But let's keep the conversation around climate change going. And as consumers, remember, we play a part. Look for those crests for sustainability, organic, climate smart. And when it makes sense and when you can, support local. Cheers.